Hello, everyone. Hello, friends, environmental defenders. I am so honored to be here and to listen to all the work that's been done. And it's being done in the Caribbean. I always say that in our region, we know our situation, and therefore we have the solutions to the issues that we face. I'm going to present briefly on the work that I am involved in Guyana. As Terrell mentioned, my work incorporates gender and environmental justice very holistically because of my lived experience living in a family that had experienced various forms of domestic violence, and at the same time living in a country that's extremely vulnerable to climate impacts. And on the day to day, you see it play out the same. You see gender injustice and you see climate injustice. We can talk about ExxonMobil, but that would be a whole nother presentation. Today, I'm here and I would like to say that I stand in solidarity with the presenters before. I am so impressed and so inspired by the work that's been done in Bonaire, in Jamaica, in Barbuda. I continue to use those stories and those actions as inspiration for my work in Guyana, because as you know, we are living through a battle against ExxonMobil, a global entity that continues to wreak havoc to our coasts, but also when you look at the day-to-day livelihood and well-being of our people, in the next couple of years, you can definitely see how that would play out. And at the same time, as people that faces these issues, as people that was brought to the Caribbean, taken, fooled into coming to the Caribbean. Now we are faced with the climate crisis, and the climate crisis, fighting against it, it doesn't come at easy cost. It's a very high price you pay to talk about the climate crisis and talk about the issues you face. And in Guyana, we usually see how climate and gender intersects. And, it's really important for me to note that last year, this month actually makes 1 year since a fire occurred at Madia, an indigenous community in Guyana that took the life of 20 young children. And it's important for me to mention that because there are gender and environmental dynamics that played out in that fire. It's also important for me when I'm talking about the climate crisis, to note that we are living through a period of genocides. We're seeing it play out, and it's important for us to call it out when we see it. We're seeing it in Gaza, we're seeing it in Sudan, in Congo, and right in our community in Haiti. And whenever I'm given the spotlight, it's important for me to raise and talk about what's going on in the world. It's important for us to adjust our lens in our country, in the Caribbean, and more so in the world, because genocide links directly into ecocides. So as mentioned before, I'm the founder of the Breadfruit Collective, and I'm going to be sharing a few of the campaigns, the work that I'm involved with regionally, to give you a regional perspective of some of the solutions and some of the networks that are available, because I want you to know that there are work being done. And as you heard from the presenters previously, I hope you're feeling inspired to know that despite we face the climate crisis, we are also people of grit. We're standing up to it, and we're fighting against it as much as we can. So the world is currently dealing with multiple and intertwined crises: the climate crisis, unprecedented biodiversity loss, and raising inequality. Recovering process could provide a unique opportunity to pave the way to a better future that places climate, nature, and of course, people and the most marginalized people at the center. And I think that's what we want. We understand the climate crisis, we understand the recovery process, and we understand what it means to center people that are most affected. And that's what we're pushing for. That's what we want our government to do. Threats and pressures on the environment and its resources amplify gender inequality and power imbalances in communities that are already coping with resource scarcity and societal stress. We know in times of disaster, gender-based violence, other types of violences usually goes up. And we know climate-induced disasters are going to be continuously occurring because, again, of the way we have lived, not us in the Caribbean specifically, but the impacts that it has on our lives. Approaches to the climate crisis must be feminist, must be grounded in intersectional approaches. And when I said feminist and intersectional approaches, it means that we're creating space for those most vulnerable, those most affected. And so my approach to this work has always been the Caribbean has always been left out. We're still being left out of spaces when we're talking about intersectional climate justice. And so if we're going to create spaces, we have to make sure that we're creating spaces for people who don't look like us. We have to create spaces for Indigenous people who have been on this land for long, who has been taking care of our forests. We have to make spaces for people with disability, LGBTQ persons, young people, elderly people. We have to make space because it's important for us to know the various narratives that would impact the solutions that we develop. And so my organization, along with the Climate Conscious podcast, previously have held two conferences centering Caribbean women. The conference is called Caribbean Women for Climate Justice, the annual conference to really facilitate regional engagement and engagement on having these discussions on climate and gender and focusing specifically on the Caribbean. In 2022, we started not knowing what it would be, but then in 2023, we were happy to announce that 500 people had registered, and again, featuring people from diverse backgrounds and lived experience, LGBTQ persons with disability, Indigenous community, and having these conversations in a way whereby we're not siloed, we're having it together. And most importantly, last year, we were able to have translation. And language justice is so important to the Caribbean because we are not only an English-speaking place. So we were happy that we were able to have translation in Spanish, French, and sign language. Most recently, we held another campaign called Truth Be Told, a Caribbean call for action on gender and climate justice. And many persons on this call was involved in that campaign. We did this in line with the COP that was happening. As grassroots people, we know that the COP is not the end all be all for us. Life goes on. And so we use the momentum that's usually for the COP, and we held this campaign. And really, we really wanted to raise awareness on gender and climate, to advocate for policy change and amplify the voices of people who are already doing the work in the Caribbean. And so all these resources, we have reports from the conferences, we have the panels recorded on YouTube, on the YouTube page of Breadfruit Collective, but you can also find recordings on the podcast. Javal Bazzi from the Climate Conscious podcast has transferred all the panels into podcasts. And so you can access these resources, and we encourage you to access the resources and use it. Because again, we usually find that it's really hard to find data in our region. And so when we are doing all of these campaigns, these conferences, one of the things that we're trying to do is to create that resources that people can use, that people can actually use in supporting their policy in their work. And we try to make it as accessible as possible. And importantly, so both the conference in 2023 and the campaign, it was supported by the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance. And this is an alliance that I'm a part of, and I'm really, really proud of it. It's a part of Canary, and I'm going to encourage everyone here to, if you're a part of an organization, to be a part of the Climate Justice Alliance. And the Alliance aims to amplify the voices of the most vulnerable and those on the front lines of the climate crisis in the Caribbean and enhance the impacts for climate justice, including linkages to environmental justice, economic justice, social and racial justice. So we do have a number of thematic groups: access to finance, adaptation, loss and damage, gender, human rights, just nature-based solution, just transition, and roots of climate change. And it's important for you to know that the importance of community. When we're fighting it, when we're fighting against these big entities, you may find that we may be alone in this. And so it's important for me to highlight these networks and these alliances because it gives you a sense of what's happening in the Caribbean. And also because we're small spaces, small countries, small territories, a lot of times we lack resources and capacities. But when you're a part of alliances, and for me, as a young person fighting against and even being targeted as a young person, I find there's so much hope in these alliances, in these communities that are really grounded in grassroots action. So currently there are 50 civil society organizations that are a part of the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance. And again, I welcome all of you to check out Canary. And even if you want to follow up with me to provide more information on it, when you join the Alliance, you can be a part of a thematic group and you can be a part of the work that's being done. You can also work and create the agenda. This is another part of the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance that came out of COP last year, was the Caribbean Climate Justice and Resiliency Agenda. And basically, this is a roadmap 2023 to 2030. It was based on the thematic groups. We came together and we produced this document, and it's aimed to be a roadmap for people to use, for them to use, and you can adapt to it based on the work that you are doing. It enables collective advocacy to amplify the voices of the most vulnerable and influence national, region, and global policy. The agenda enables collective action towards pro-poor, inclusive, environmental, sustainable, and climate resiliency approaches to development. It's a shared vision for and by civil society. As I mentioned before, we were the ones that authored, that wrote chapters in the agenda. And so again, I'll encourage you to check it out. It's available online, and really look and see how it can, how it can work in your case, how it can be attached to the work that you're doing or you want to do within your community. So Mr. John mentioned the Stronger Caribbean Together network, and I couldn't agree more with everything that he had mentioned about this network. I am so grateful that my organization is also part of the Stronger Caribbean Together network. And this is another grassroots network that connects communities across the Caribbean, aimed with generational knowledge and with experiencing who are battling the impacts of the climate crisis. While the rest of the world braces for climate crisis, and this is from their website, Caribbean communities began reeling from its impact decades ago. As we know, as people from the Caribbean, we did not cause the climate crisis. And if you look at how we lived, we are people that know our land. We were brought here to work the land. So it is in us to take care of our land. So when we talk about the climate crisis, I like to say that we already have the solutions, because we have been living in a way in line with nature for as long as can be. And so I really appreciate this network, because it really shows us what's the power that is within grassroots groups. And it's another network I'll encourage you to join. I'm so grateful that I am a part of the network, and I was able to become aware of both Mr. John and Miss Jackie's work in Barbuda. And as I mentioned before, it continues to be an inspiration for my work in Guyana and our work as human rights activists in Guyana fighting against Exxon. And lastly, I will speak a bit about the climate justice camp. So I am very, very, very interested in creating spaces. I know what it's like to be excluded. And so for me, because now I have a platform, it's important for me that when I'm entering a space, I am taking it, whatever I'm learning, I'm bringing it back to my community. And so last year I was in Lebanon. I was invited to a climate justice camp. The camp was it was the second of its kind. So there was one in Tunisia and one in Lebanon, and it had over 450 people there. However, when I was looking for the Caribbean group, there was only about 5 or 6 of us. And you can imagine, again, our stories being lost. And it was really a goal of mine, and also the other Caribbean activists that were there, to really bring a camp like that was held in Lebanon to the Caribbean. And so I'm just so proud that in March of this year, we were able to hold the Climate Justice Camp Caribbean edition, the first of its kind in St. Martin. And we were able to bring together 120 environmental activists from across the Caribbean, from the French, Dutch, Spanish, English Caribbean, to really come together and talk about the issues we face, talk about the solutions, talk about our struggle, and talk about it in a way that's really real life. A lot of times we don't really get to talk to each other and be in spaces with each other and to hold each other. And so this camp was really, it left a lasting impact. And I'm so honored to be able to say that I was able to be on the back end of working towards bringing this to the Caribbean and making it possible. And I would like to also share that although the camp ended, another network that was started by the people that attended the camp. And there's so much plans that's being implemented, that's being in the works. Because again, when you bring people together, and I like to say again, Caribbean people, we love to be in company with each other. We are people that are extremely smart, that is extremely knowledgeable of our context. And so I saw this in real life, how this played out, and I see it played out right now past the camp, the solutions that are coming out from it. So that's a little bit about the work that I do regionally. As I mentioned before, gender and climate justice is really intersectional. And so you would see and you would often hear that I'm talking about, bodily autonomy, mental health, education, youth development, because these are all issues that intersects with the environment. I also have children, programming for children and young adults, because it's really important when we're talking about these issues, we're talking about it in a really holistic, inclusive, and intergenerational space and an intergenerational way, because we know that the climate crisis really requires that all of us are coming and all of us are using what we can with what we have to really change the narrative. And before I close, I just want to read a quote. Because whatever has happened to humanity, whatever is currently happening, it is happening to all of us. No matter how hidden the cruelty, no matter how far off the screams of pain and terror, we live on one world and we live in one Caribbean. And so the struggles that we face, we talk about the intersectionalities of our identities, but we can also talk about the intersectionalities of our struggles. And when we win, it's not just a win for ourselves, but it's definitely a win for the entire Caribbean. So with that, I'll close. Thank you so much, Terrell.